So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our usual Monday evening meeting. It's slightly different this year for members' evening. Obviously, we'd be used to meeting in the library and sort of a number of short talks given by members. Slightly different format this evening. So, what I can do give is a bit of a brief preview of all our speakers this evening. So, give us a wave, everybody. That's it. So the way it's going to work this evening is that what I'll do, just as before each speaker, I'll just pop up a screen. We'll get set up for the particular speaker, and then we'll launch straight into their presentations. At the end of the evening, what we'll do is we'll all get onto the screen like we are now, and then if you've got any questions for anybody, if you email them in or on the chat, then we can do from there. So if you just bear with me, we'll get set up for Chris, our first speaker. So Chris is all ready to go. So our first speaker this evening, Chris Hall. We're talking about the sculpted frieze on the school here at Westwood. Over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Simon, and hello everybody. Didn't actually expect to be giving a second Zoom lecture in this year of the society, but there you go. Tonight I want to share some of my researches that I've been doing into architecture and architects in Scarborough and the wider area. So Nicholas Pevsner's Buildings of England series book on the North Riding was published in 1966, and actually he did research in 1964. And I think it's the only one that hasn't run to a second edition. And Dr. Jane Grenville of York University is updating the book, and we hope to get Jane to come and speak to us possibly later in the year. And I've been giving her some assistance in the Scarborough and wider area. And I just wanted to share with you tonight one little piece of research I've been doing, which is in the sculpted frieze, as I refer to it, at what was originally called the higher grade school. Most people now know it as the Muni or the Municipal Grammar School or the Boys High School. But it's this frieze across the top here, if you could see it. Let's go on to laser pointer. There we are. It's this frieze across here. The high grade school was opened in 1900. It was designed by Sir Thomas Edwin Cooper. Latterly, he was just known as Edwin Cooper rather than Thomas. 1874 to 1942, a Scarborough lad. I don't have a portrait of Fehr himself, who was born in 1867 and died in 1940. And one of his specialisms was architectural sculpture. And he was commissioned to provide sculpture for the school, or to adorn the building, as the magazine The Builder puts it, with sculpture having some reference to its objects. And here they are. Running across the central ones, we have astronomy, architecture, engineering, and chemistry, and they're flanked by literature and what is said to be music, but actually has one or two other things in as well. So if we start with the first one, astronomy, this is the one that initially piqued my interest, in that all of the central frieze, astronomy, architecture, engineering, and chemistry, all of them have entirely male subjects, other than this one, which has a single female subject here. And I got to thinking about this. The normal description of these friezes is that they illustrate pupils learning. Well, I got to thinking, this has got to be more than this. There's got to be some significance in this one female in this panel. And I was looking at the costume, which looks late 18th, early 19th century. And I developed the theory that this was actually William Herschel and his sister Caroline, who worked with him as an astronomer. And I sort of developed this idea, and eventually, doing some digging, I came up with from an article in the Builder magazine of 1901, volume 80, June 8th, which is available online through Yale University. Interestingly, because they're the sponsors of the Pevsner series. And sure enough, there's a description there of the sculptural frieze by Fehr, and this proved my theory to be correct, and also my theory I developed for the other friezes. Strangely enough, the listed building description for the school, which was updated about a year ago, is positive that this is Caroline Herschel. It doesn't mention William at all, and yet the article in the Builder magazine refers to Herschel, i.e. William, and speculates that this might be Caroline. So I don't know where the listed building description people are getting their information from, and there are one or two other anomalies in that description. But a fantastic piece of sculpture. This they're sitting around a globe. They've got a telescope here, and presumably these are pupils learning from the master William and Caroline Herschel. These are rather generic faces, but if we go on to some portraits, here is William Herschel himself, 1738 to 1822. He's got a very distinctive face and I suppose a distinctive shape of head, which if we go back here, I think we can see that that's a fairly good reproduction of the portrait. Not so with Caroline Herschel. Fehr's depiction of her is very much more romantic than we see here. She's got this flowing hair, flowing dress, and whatever, which is not really like our normal image of Caroline Herschel as shown here, looking through the telescope, similar to that which is shown on the sculptured frieze. The next one I thought must be Christopher Wren, because here's a character holding what appears to be the dome of St. Paul's. Another person here holding a roll, which presumably is a plan. Calipers, which architects would use for setting out masonry, or the masons would. And again, these are generic faces. And the article in the Builder says that the principal subject is Christopher Wren. It's hard to tell, though, which is the principal subject. Whether it's this one holding the dome of St. Paul's or this one holding the drawings. Very much characteristic clothing and wigs of the time. So if we go on, here's a couple of portraits of Wren himself. The most famous one, perhaps that on the right by Godfrey Kneller, showing Wren aged about 79, and generally thought to be a flattering portrait of him. And the other one by John Klosterman, about 20 years earlier, so he's around about 59 in this case. And in both cases, he has a drawing of St. Paul's in this case draped over the table, and in this case holding it in his hand, rather in the same manner of scrolly depiction as on the sculptural frieze. Sorry, that's a very difficult expression to get out, sculptural frieze, with St. Paul's in the background. So I'm beginning to think that the one on the left is Wren himself. And just going into the realms of speculation, I wonder if one of the other characters, this one here, is actually based on Nicholas Hawksmoor, who, of course, was Wren's right-hand man in the building of St. Paul's, again holding a set of calipers and there's drawing in his hand. So there's the possibility that one of these others might be based on Hawksmoor. This one's very much more straightforward. It's said to be engineering, and here we have a guy with a wheel in a vise on a bench. He's filing it to shape. There's a hammer and a geometrical shape here, an anvil, a guy with his sleeves rolled up and holding a heavy hammer. You don't quite see it from here. Again, the generic faces. So mechanical engineering, not civil engineering or structural engineering. The costume, very characteristic, late 18th, early 19th century. So my own feeling was that that had to be James Watt. And sure enough, the article in the Builder, which I found, confirms that it is James Watt. And in fact, 2 years later, Fehr did a freestanding sculpture of Watt, which is in City Square, Leeds. And there's a lot of similarities between the two pieces of sculpture. It's almost as if he's working from the same source, some kind of portrait or whatever of what would just pop back. There he is holding his hand in a very characteristic way, and a drawing in the other hand, or a scroll or whatever. Scroll holding his hand in a very, very characteristic way. So there's no doubt that is James Watt. The final one puzzled me initially. It's said to be chemistry, and I have to say my understanding of the history of the science of chemistry is perhaps not as strong as it is on astronomy, architecture and engineering. And I did puzzle about this. It's rather sort of will-o'-the-wisp character, really, sort of dreaming here sitting in a chair with some more of Fehr's generic faces. They're very similar, flanking on either side. And the costume appears to be early 18th century. And my initial thought was that perhaps this was Isaac Newton, and that it isn't actually chemistry, it's actually natural philosophy and alchemy, which Newton was involved with. We've got here some chemical apparatus on the bench here that these lads are playing with. But the article in the Builder magazine was confident that it was actually Joseph Priestley. I find it hard to square this portrait of Priestley with the image in the sculptural frieze. The clothing is very much more sort of Puritan, almost a very stark wig. If we look here, quite sort of florid clothing, curly wig. The similarities are not at all obvious, and I do still wonder whether it was in fact meant to be based on Isaac Newton. This is a mid-19th century image of Newton. It's very, very much romanticized in the way he's sitting, pensively with a book in his hand, is holding his chin in his hand here. It does make me wonder whether it still is Newton, but we'll have to go by what the article in the Builder says, because that was written at the time, and it says it was Joseph Priestley. I now want to go on to the two flanking sculptures. The one on the right is literature. Excuse me. There's a wonderful piece of carving, incredibly flowing, almost Baroque, I think, in its way. All of these girls here, again, have got generic fair faces, but I just love the flowing hair and the way the books flow like this. And this is presumably the teacher. Whether this is based on an actual character, we don't know. The article in the Builder magazine is silent on that, and I wouldn't even like to make a guess about that one. And then the frieze on the left-hand side, again, this wonderfly flowing sculptural work, absolutely fantastic, is said to be music. So we've got a lady with a harp here. Presumably this lady's holding a book of music and so on. But curiously, at the extreme right-hand end, you've got this lady who is working as a sculptor. I'll just go into that in a little bit more detail. Something really weird happening with the brick there. Sleeves rolled up, a mason's maul in her hand, and she's carving a statue here. It's a really quite a vigorous piece of sculpture. It's fantastic work. And I have been speculating, and this now is pure speculation, as to whether Fehr's inspiration for this was the sculptor Frances Darlington, 1880 to 1940, who was very active in Yorkshire. I think she was from Birstall. And one of the works she did, curiously, was Joseph Priestley. This is the maquette. It's in the Kirklees Museum. It's the maquette for a statue of Priestley, which stands in Bursley. It's a bronze one. So there's a few linkages there which make me think that Fehr was actually inspired by Frances Darlington, and Darlington herself was inspired by Fehr's work. So I need to do a little bit more looking into that. So unfortunately, the sculptural frieze is not all that easy to see now because of the growth of the trees in front of the school, although this time of year you can see them a lot better than in the summer, and it's well worth going down there to have a look. And really, it's a fantastic piece of work. I would say of national repute, and it deserves to be much better known than it is. It would be nice, for instance, to have some kind of interpretation panel in front of the building, to tell us about Fehr and to tell us about these this piece of sculpture. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thanks, Chris. That was fantastic. What we'll do now is we'll just get set up for our next speaker. If you've got any questions for Chris, we can put them to him at the end. So email address is shown below there, or you can put them onto the chat window if you're watching on a computer from there. So if you just leave it with us a couple of minutes, we'll get set up for our next speaker. Right, so I think we're set up now for Vanessa. Vanessa Milner, who's going to be talking about agriculture and food production in the Second World War. So over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and friends as well. Whilst doing some research on another topic, I came across some what I think are very interesting facts and figures about agriculture, etc., in the Second World War. Did you know that our farms and countryside and fields, well, they were in a bit of a state in the 1930s. They looked a bit like this. Whereas we expect bushes and brambles near the hedgerows, they were all growing towards the middle. The lowlands weren't drained, and well, it was in a bit of a state. But why were they like this? Well, if we go back to the First World War, the landowners and lords and earls, when you think they fought alongside the men in the trenches, and they died alongside them as well, and some were heirs to estates. So there was nobody to look after the land and nobody to look after the estates. Now, there was no money either, of course, after the war, and conditions anyway on farms were always bad. The sanitation and the water and electricity supplies were terrible. So nobody wanted to work there anyway. And we all know about what happened at the Lost Gardens of Heligan. Well, it was the same in the farms as well. Now, at this time, we were only producing about 30% of the food that we needed, less than a third. It was cheaper to import our food than it was to produce it ourselves. Tenant farmers who couldn't make a living, they just abandoned the farms and took off, leaving it all up to nature. Now, mechanisation was barely present on the farms. The heavy horses did most of the work. There were some tractors, but they pulled mechanical implements. They didn't power them. Now, there were tractors, but if you look, they had no cabs, and they had all these all-steer rear wheels, and they were fitted with angled cleats to grip the fields. They gripped the fields, but going out on the roads with them was a bit rough. Rubber tyres did appear, but much later in the war. Now, in 1914, at the beginning of the Great War, we had nearly 11 million acres of land cultivated. By 1938, there was only 9 million. We'd lost 2 million acres. But war was imminent, and we were an island, so something had to be done. On the 1st of September 1939, the Emergency Powers Defence Act gave the Ministry of Agriculture drastic powers to intervene. The government announced that it would pay £2 for every acre of grassland ploughed up. So by the middle of September, 12,000 farmers had applied, and 220,000 acres had qualified for the grant. Now, they also amended the law as well, so that boys as young as 12 and upwards could actually drive tractors on the road. As I say, it wasn't very easy, although I'm sure many of these boys had actually driven tractors on the fields already. The Agricultural Development Act of 1939 increased government powers. This was to buy agricultural equipment like tractors and fertilisers. They also increased the drainage grant at that time as well. Another thing they did was to reform in 1939 the War Agricultural Executive Committees. These are known as WARAGs. Now, each county had one of these committees, and what it was made of perhaps retired farmers and people, men that knew about the land, and it gave them a lot of powers over farmers and landowners. Excuse me. What they first did was they performed surveys of the land to see what was going on, but it gave them permission to enter a farmer's land and tell them what crops to plant. To increase the production of foodstuff. And it did work. There was a big increase in production. But as you can imagine, some farmers would welcome this and some didn't. There was one such man, apparently he wasn't much of a farmer, he just used to parade around his field with his shotgun. And when he saw these WARAGs approaching, he threatened them. So the committee came back with armed police. There was a shootout and he was shot dead. Farms that didn't come up to scratch eventually requisitioned, but they were offered back to the owners after the war. Now, all these things increased the yields in the fields, but not the workforce. So there was all this extra work and nobody to do it. And of course, the farm labourers were being called up, and some of them were volunteering. So what the government did, they brought the unemployed from the cities, they brought refugees, and they even encouraged school children and conscientious objectors. It still wasn't enough. Now, in one of the years, I read there was a big production of potatoes, and the government called on volunteers. They needed thousands, particularly in Lincolnshire, where most of them were produced. And they were several thousand short, and they couldn't afford to lose the crop at time of war. So what they did, they gave children quite a few days off school, and they all went into the fields to save the day. The war ags even increased the farm workers' wages, but it did little to prevent them from leaving the farms. So they brought prisoners of war in as well. But every source you read says that one German worker is worth 12 Italians. And after the Italians were repatriated, apparently they were hardly missed. Whereas the Germans, they were known to be hard workers, many of which stayed after the war and married local girls. So it was up to the women of the country. The Women's Land Army, the WLA, was reformed with Gertrude Denman as the director. By 1943, over 87,000 women were working on the land. They were known as land girls, as you probably have heard before. But it was said that the best and the hardest workers, well, they came from Yorkshire, of course. And these are some of the jobs they do. You can see that that tractor's actually got some rubber tyres on it. Now, each county had its own administration team, and in Yorkshire, eventually, it was a Miss Jacob Smith. Excuse me. Now, in the First World War, it didn't really work with the Land Army because the conditions were so poor for them. They had to bed down in the farms with no. Well, the conditions basically were were terrible. So what they did in the Second World War, they took over large houses, and eventually large hostels were built. Now, there's a book in our local library about the WLA in Yorkshire, just in Yorkshire, and I can thoroughly recommend it. There's tales and photographs from the woman who joined. And it says in there, it's not just a list, it tells you about every house and every hostel that there was. And it is very interesting. Near here, there was a large house in Stockton and the Forest, and there was one in Muston near Filey. And it seems they were all run by wardens, and they weren't always nice, and they weren't always honest. Still more help was needed though. So in December 1941, the government introduced the conscription of all unmarried women and childless widows aged 20 to 30. They were given the choice of joining either of the three auxiliary services, as the Women's Land Army, the Civil Defence, or working in industry. Now, I had no idea that they sort of had to join these. I know my mother worked in munitions at Thorpe Arch, and I grew up with some of the often gruesome stories about what happened there. In the mid-war years also, there was some 700,000 old age pensioners returned to work, and most of those went into agriculture. Food ration, of course, was brought in early 1940, and it continued until well after the war, until the early 1950s. Sugar was the last thing to be rationed. In 1936, all the factories that were using sugar beet, because of course the sugar came from abroad, had stopped with the war. All the factories were amalgamated by Parliament, and they formed one organisation called the British Sugar Corporation. And apparently it made it all a much easier life for the producers. Now, sugar was in demand for many things, but one of them, of course, was jam making, especially for Women's Institute. In 1940, by harvest time, the Women's Institutes had organised some 1,000 preservation centres. They were established all over the country. They were in farm kitchens, village halls and schools, with a government grant as well to buy the sugar. They made 1,600 plus tonnes of jam that year. Now, in nearby Rosedale, near here up on the North York Moors, 8 jam makers became quite famous. they produced 3.5 tons without electricity or gas. They boiled up the vats on an oil stove, and they used water which was carried by hand from 1/4 of a mile away. Now, wheat was one of the important crops, but we needed to replace the supply of cotton from abroad. Of course, that had dried up. So what we had to do was really introduce the production of flax. It was virtually out of production in England by this time. Now, flax is also known as linseed. I've no idea it was one of the same. They've got little blue flowers. Now, the advantage of this is that they grow fast. If you sow them in March, you can harvest them in July. And the good thing about it as well is that rabbits don't like it. The seed heads were crushed for oil, and the tough stalks were processed to make cloth. And even in the Second World War, apparently they were used for wing fabric for the aircraft. Potatoes were another crop that was increased. Now, several months before Pearl Harbor and them entering the war, the United States helped to keep the shipping lanes open. And what they did, the Congress there passed the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. To begin with, it was like an export program really for farmers, and it enabled all the surplus food to be shipped over here. But eventually they supplied us and many other countries with all sorts of things. But for this talk, one of the most important things was farm machinery, especially tractors. The government introduced a Dig for Victory campaign. It called for every man and woman in Britain to turn the lawns and flower beds into vegetable gardens. I think we've all heard of this. It became so successful, more than they could ever have imagined. And of course, you see from this, the most unlikely patches of land were dug up and planted with vegetables. Look at that, the moat around the Tower of London. There was the Buckingham Palace gardens and tennis courts, railway embankments. The King really took this up as well, and all over his all around his royal palaces, he was digging up the lawns and digging up the gardens for vegetables. There was over 10 million instruction and leaflets distributed. You see, there's all different types to the British people. Some 600,000 new allotments were made available by local authorities. People were encouraged to keep chickens, and by 1945, at the end of the war, there's 1.25 million poultry keepers, and they cared for some 12 million birds. Some kept rabbits and goats, but you shall see here, pigs were especially popular because, of course, you could feed those on your kitchen waste, and anybody was allowed to keep them. Pig bins, it says there that, I think it says in there that councils would actually pick up your pig bins, but apparently they could be seen on street corners in cities and towns, and you just go along and put your kitchen waste in there. And I remember reading about it in Alan Titchmarsh's book about his childhood. Nowtborough lad, he remembers them in Ilkley very, very clearly. Excuse me. Now, as well as people, we know that thousands of persons died in the bombing raids and that, but thousands of birds were also killed. But house sparrows were persecuted in large numbers on government orders. They were said to peck blossoms on currants and gooseberries, and they ate whatever seedlings they could find. And at harvest time, they've been seen to flock to the fields and devoured huge quantities of corn. I didn't believe this at first until this year, the first year ever. They descended on my peas. It's the first year we've never had any peas, and what they didn't eat, the pigeons got, and they even attacked my sweet peas as well. They were also accused with these sparrows of destroying fledglings of other species by the war rags. So, backed by Country Life, my favourite magazine, they encouraged people, especially boys, to destroy nests and eggs. Louth Rural District Council in November 1939, Louth is in Lincolnshire, began paying 2p for each rat's tail handed in to cut down the number of rats. So how many by the March the next year do you think they caught? 42,000. In October 1940, the government brought back the Rats and Mice Destruction Act of 1919. I actually have no idea what that means, but it sounds very good, and announced that the annual Rat Week would be held. They estimated that the rats cause an annual damage of something like £12 million, which is about 600 million today. And to prove that the WLA actually participated in the collection of rats, they are really rats run around that lady's body. Now, the war ags paid vermin bounties. They would vary from county to county, but they were generally twopence for a rat's tail, threepence for a grey squirrel's tail, because they were known as vermin with bushy tails, and a halfpenny for a sparrow's head. I cannot imagine anybody chopping off a sparrow's head, but that's what it was all about. Now, rabbits were another big problem. Many fields yielded only a quarter of what they should have done. And they said there were so many in some fields, the whole field seemed to be moving. On a farm in Hampshire, 4 guns killed 940 rabbits in the morning. But they say that's a hell of a lot, isn't it? It said that it made little difference. The good thing, of course, is that rabbits can be eaten. Wood pigeons are another pest. Of course, they still are. And again, country life suggested mass culls. Now, as you can imagine, owners of plant nurseries saw their incomes reduced because all the greenhouses and land had to be altered to produce food. And poor old Harry Wheatcroft had to dig up acres of roses for cereals, and I'm sure it was very reluctantly. There was also a tremendous drive for collecting herbs. Herbs and such like, of course, used to come from Europe and the Far East. But we wanted them not just for food flavourings, but for medicines. And all that had been cut off. So people were encouraged to forage in the hedgerows. Now, one of the things that they collected was rose hips to make a syrup rich in vitamin C. I was brought up on rosehip syrup. It was beautiful, but I've never seen it these days. Now, parks also suffered. There's Hyde Park being dug up for sandbanks. Apparently, it's laid on a lot of sand. And when you purchased fruit and vegetables, it wasn't straightforward because there was a paper shortage. Some extra 6.5 million acres were brought back into cultivation during the 6 years of war. When the Second World War officially ended on the 2nd of September 1945, the it ended on the 2nd of September. The WLA was disbanded some 5 years later. Now, the USA's Lend-Lease agreement ended directly the war. That was it. Stop. No more food. Apparently, the USA wanted to keep in with the countries in Europe which were starving. So all the food that they had, the surplus food, was directed over there. But although the food had been strictly rationed during the war, they reckon the requirements of the population had been met, and on the whole, it was a lot more healthy than it is today. Well, farmers still suffer today, of course, mostly because they're dependent on the weather. The farm machinery is very expensive, and once again, government grants and all the help that they give is changing now. In the past, they've had to compete with European countries who've had all the large government grants to support them. We don't know how Brexit's going to affect the farmers or the pandemic, but we need our farms and our countryside, and we need to preserve them, not fill them with more and more houses. So I say, support our farmers, buy British and buy local.
Vanessa, that's great. What a lovely note to end on, and I think a sentiment we can all echo. So if you just bear with us a minute or so, we'll move on to the next one. The next one's a recorded talk by my wife and myself. So if you just bear with me, we'll get that set up and come back to you very soon. Okay, so I think we're all queued up here, so I'll pass over to our pre-recorded talk.
Good evening. In this short talk, we'll be telling you what we so far discovered about the story of Charlie and Winnie, a couple who corresponded and married during the Great War.
Our talk this evening is based on research we've started on a postcard album that was found in the basement of a property on Westwood here in Scarborough. It contains 97 postcards and one photographic negative. The earliest card in the album is postmarked the 27th of July 1905, and the last card with a postmark is dated the 3rd of April 1918. Some of the cards, however, are undoubtedly later but not dated. This evening we'll be looking at the cards received and some sent by the owner of the album to her beloved around the time of the Great War.
We believe the owner of the album was Winifred Wilson, who was born on the 10th of January 1892 in Russup near Whitby. She was a daughter of Frederick Wilson, a man who worked his way up from a farm labourer to join the police and worked up to be a police superintendent in Richmond, having previously worked in both Scarborough and Whitby. Winnie had one sibling, a younger sister, Nora.
The author of the majority of the cards we're looking at this evening was Charles Edward Rummer. Charles was born on the 10th of December 1886 in St Pancras in London, and his parents, William and Caroline, lived on Tottenham Court Road. On the 1901 census, at the age of 14, he's listed as working as a telegraph messenger, living in Hammersmith. By 1911, now boarding, but still in Hammersmith, he's working as a sorter for the post office. And on a postcard kept by Winnie from September 1913, Charles is addressed as being a sapper in the Royal Engineers Postal Section in Bletchley.
This postcard is dated September 13.
Oh, wow.
On the back, they're listed 8 names, but 9 men are shown. We understand the cap badges of the Royal Engineers, and written on the back of the card is Army Manoeuvres. Charlie's not listed as a name on the card, but we believe from other photographs that he could be the man in the top centre of this photograph.
The next 2 cards are written by Winnie to Charlie, and we sincerely hope they're a satirical view of Scarborough at the time. Seems that everywhere is to let, despite it being marked as being Scarborough at the height of the season. The church offers sleeping accommodation with beds to let. The Carlton, this whole place, whole note spelt without a W, is to let. Even the gasometer is to let, as well as being furnished.
Further dubious behaviour is shown on this postcard, showing the open-air treatment available at Scarborough by moonlight. In the bachelors' quarters sits a gentleman in the company of 2 ladies, and in the married quarters appears to be a scatter of sleeping drunks. Across the 2 cards, Winnie writes, "Dearest Charlie, just a line to let you know if it'd be all right to send the box on Monday, as I wondered whether you were alone in the house and the box might not be taken in. Feel awfully tired. Hope you have a nice week and hope you'll be lucky Monday. Drop me a line and let me know. I'll be writing your letter tomorrow and I'll put it in the box. We're up to our eyes in work." We're unsure what she actually did for work, but what we can assume is they both knew that war was coming.
Just 4 days later, on the 4th of August 1914, war was declared.
This card shows York Minster. Presumably, Charlie was returning after some leave as he writes, "My dear Winnie, arrived back in good time, everything in good order, so quite safe. Only 1 or 2 missed me. Hope to leave for Southampton Friday evening and across to France. Will write and tell you all the scenes. Dearest love, Charlie."
The next cards were sent as a group, passed by the censors, but tantalisingly we only have the first 3 of an unknown number. The first card shows the route to Ypres, and Charlie writes, "My dearest Winifred, we rested here the night, the enemy having left during the morning. Done a lot of damage to private property. Roads are very heavy owing to the rain. Make it rather bad for biking. I've now advanced to Belgium, so you can see I've covered a good deal of ground. Quite a holiday in a way. Got plenty to do in the evening, so don't get very much sleep. Still, I'm glad to say I'm fit and well. I've now been away for 10 weeks, seems more like 10 months. The days are passing quicker now, but not quick enough to my liking. Still, as long as I get home safe and that German power is subdued, is all I care. I know waiting at home for my return is happiness and love, so dearie, I will look forward to you. Don't think I get homesick. In fact, I'm only too pleased to be out here. Something to be proud of, but there is a certain amount of feeling about getting home safe that makes one feel uneasy. Not that I'm afraid, for I've been in the very thick of it, but I've realised that when two are in love, life is very sweet. And I tell you truly that I realise all the thoughts that I've fostered in my mind this last year. So don't think that I'm sorry that I've came here. About roughing it, it does not bother me in the least. Of course, I've a certain amount of responsibility to answer for. Things always don't always go right. Get a lecture from the staff captain sometimes for some trifling error, which cannot be helped under the circumstances. However, as regards my work and duty, I've been recommended by our officers for the Royal Engineers Post Office Service, hence my promotion. I'm the youngest sergeant in the corps, but senior to a good many, so I feel a little proud about it. Also more so because I want you to share the pleasure with me. A sergeant in the Engineers carries, and this is where the next card is missing. The card shows a Half Moon pub, which is still present in Kemmelberg today, and is in Belgium, although its location is not quite so rural nowadays.
This card was sent from Charlie on the 25th of November 1914 from the British Expeditionary Force headquarters. It's a stock French postcard of a romantic couple. It's addressed to Winne at Thornsgill Manor Road, Scarborough. It would seem possible, therefore, that Winne was here in Scarborough at the time of the bombardment on the 16th of December. This card was sent again by Charlie slightly earlier in the war and carries the phrase health and happiness in French. This is clear that Charlie and Winne are looking forward, as written on the back of the card is happy thoughts of the future.
This card is dated the 13th of March 1915 and it features silk embroidery. It's a souvenir that French and Belgian women would make to produce and sell to the soldiers in France and Belgium at the time. The optimism of the earlier cards is waning somewhat as Charlie writes, keeping well, things are waking up now, troops are everywhere, many German prisoners, also alas, many, many wounded. The weather has greatly improved, love Charlie. Inside the embroidery on the front is inserted a card showing the flags of the United Kingdom, France, Belgium and Russia. It reads, Honour to our valiant soldiers.
This card was sent to Nora, Winnie's sister, on the 29th of April 1915. She was in the workhouse in Durham and it was sent by Charlie. No, I haven't forgotten you. We'll send you a letter as soon as possible. Things are very lively here now. We can see this place quite plainly from our HQ. Sorry to hear that you are poorly. So, this reference to her being poorly is maybe why the letter was addressed to the workhouse. The workhouse was a place where people could obtain health care prior to the NHS. We don't know whether the view upset Nora at all, because on the 2nd of May 1915, this card was sent again by Charlie to Miss Wilson, who is now in Church Street, Durham, with OK, love Charlie. Perhaps Nora was upset by this destruction and Charlie sent a more pleasant view.
These next two cards are dated the 23rd of August 1916. Now, although Charlie was working in the postal service, this doesn't mean that they were away from the shelling. Charlie writes, this is the front view of our house. We had our field post office in the house where the notice is on the door. This is telling the men where the whereabouts of the new office. This was taken a couple of days after the damage and you can see they have replaced the slates on the roof. Charlie's note on the front of the card says, "Shell burst here." The second card, again dated the same date, shows the rear of the same property, and Charlie has written, "I used to sleep in this room," indicating the shuttered window on the top floor. He writes, "Dearest, here we have the back view. Give one a fair view of the damage. We had our food cooked here and just had finished when the first shell came over and burst into the garden, uprooting a tree. The people of the house soon cleared to the cellar just in time to escape." Charlie is noted on the bottom, in the bottom left-hand corner, just under the window. There's a little mark that indicates the room in which he was sat when this first shell burst. It's also worth noting that 10% of the post office workforce in the Great War were casualties of the war.
Charlie and Winnie seem to have had an impending date for their marriage. As on the back of this card, Charlie writes, "My darling, I will look out for your letter tomorrow. Feel too disappointed to write. Leave is still open to officers, but not for men." Charlie emphasises the "not" in this card. The card shows a captured German trench, which has been redacted by the censors. We've noticed in the album a number of the cards have been redacted in this fashion.
Now, we don't have a confirmed date for Charlie and Winnie's marriage, but we do know it was between October and December in 1916. And we did mention at the start that the album did contain one photographic negative. And from that, we've been able to produce this photograph, which we maybe believe to be Charlie and Winnie, but we don't know the date that this photograph was taken.
These cards sent on the 21st of December 1917. So there's quite a jump in the dates of the card, but this is the first card addressed to Winnie as Mrs. C. Rummer, and Charlie seems to have picked up a few bits of French by now by writing "Bonjour" on this card. He seems a little bit more bravo now that they've finally got married.
Now, this card was sent on the 3rd of April 1918, and thoughts seemed to be turning towards the end of the war. Charlie writes, "Dearest, we'll be writing you a letter tomorrow. We are out again for a few days, so we'll have chance of a bath and a clean change. Not before it was needed. Don't trouble to send me any food. A little soap, toothpaste, and a brush will be useful. I doubt whether leave will reopen again. Have a week or two yet. Cheerio and love, Charlie."
We know that Charlie survived the war and he was awarded the British War Medal and returned to continue to serve as an acting quartermaster in the Royal Engineers. Sadly, Charlie passed away on the 1st of February 1920. We don't know what caused his death, but there is a slight possibility he may have been a victim of the Spanish flu. Winnie seems to have applied for her widow's pension, and this was refused, almost exactly a year after Charlie's death. The reason given for the refusal was the disease was contracted after discharge.
Now, after that sad loss, we know that Winnie did go on to find happiness again. She married and went on to have a daughter. Nora married a senior medical officer, and ultimately she moved to Pakistan. And when he passed away in 1964 here in Scarborough, and that was a year after the death of her husband. At the time, they were both resident in Scarborough here on West Parade Road. So this leads on to more questions and more research that we need to do into this album. So West Parade Road is just mere 100 yards away from Westwood. So we've got much more research to do, and hopefully we'll be presenting that to you in the future. So thank you very much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed that short presentation. Well, thanks to myself and my wife for that one. So what we'll do now, we'll just get set up for the last speaker of the evening, is Keith. So the intrigue about his striking symbol will soon be resolved. So if you just bear with us a second. Right, and so for our last speaker of the evening, it's over to you, Keith.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm talking this evening about a striking decorative symbol, or how even an experienced historian can be surprised by the sources. Thanks are due to the invaluable British newspaper archive for most of the images used for this talk. The remaining ones come from my own collection. Many years ago, a colleague of mine from Scarborough Sixth Form College often used to be working in the Scarborough room of Scarborough Library at the same time as I was. And we'd compare notes afterwards. He was a biologist, a keen musician, and was researching the history of church music in Scarborough. But whenever we compared notes, he'd say, "Well, I was doing well this morning, but unfortunately, I got sidetracked. Do you know, Bismarck's about to start a war with France?" And I don't think he ever finished his research. And I used to think, well, I'll never be distracted. But this talk is about how I have been. Some years ago, researching Yorkshire's war memorials of the First World War and their creation in the immediate aftermath of the war, I began to notice in newspapers the decorative borders surrounding articles, adverts, and so on. Some of them very plain, like these. Some of them developments of that. All sorts of images from newspapers all over the country. Some of the borders, simple in format, nevertheless had interesting symbols on them, like this. And these borders, as I say, were round articles as well as adverts. A fascinating range of illustrations. I've got hundreds of them. You're not going to see them all this evening. Round cartoons, as in this one, reproduced from Punch. And then they become more elaborate. And here's our Scarborough example. Every year, the Scarborough town brochure was advertised in newspapers and how to get hold of it. And all sorts of fancy decorations, variations on a theme began to be apparent. Designers getting more elaborate in the borders that they put around and in their adverts and so on, and no longer squares and rectangles, and some with a variety of shapes in them. And then, to my surprise, a whole range of them with this striking decorative symbol, the swastika. All these from this period, using the swastika in adverts in British newspapers, or for headings. And this one, I've blown up the side one, and you can see it very clearly. And I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, why wouldn't they use the swastika? These ones are all from before the Nazis were known outside Germany, and before the swastika took on the connotations that it did later. And in fact, in this period and earlier, the swastika was quite widely used by commercial firms in their adverts, in their products. For example, Carlsberg's headquarters in Copenhagen has swastikas on the outside. Coca-Cola produced adverts featuring the swastika. And in Dublin, there was for many years the swastika laundry. And if you think about it, there was nothing odd. The swastika was a symbol that went back a long way and was often associated with good luck or good fortune. In Britain, there's a swastika on Ilkley Moor, an ancient swastika and a Victorian replica nearby. More recently, in between the wars, the new Essex County Hall building at Chelmsford also has swastikas in it. Now, I haven't been able to show images of these for copyright reasons, but if you go online and look up the swastika in relation to Ilkley Moor or Chelmsford or Carlsberg, you'll soon come across these images. In Britain, they've been used during the First World War on war savings coupons or stamps. And these images are all to do with that. Now we have a swastika very clearly in the middle. In the mid-1920s, we find swastikas in this advert in the Keswick holiday guide. I don't know why it was put in, except as a decorative symbol. But as I say, there were no unpleasant connotations at this time. It was simply a good luck symbol that's being used for decorative purposes. But then I was taken aback because I found it around a regular column in the Shipley Times and Express from the 12th of August 1934. Now, by then, of course, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. He'd taken many steps towards establishing his dictatorship, and the swastika was very much associated with the Nazi Party. In fact, in Germany, there had been moves to make it the official symbol of the whole country. So why on earth would a Shipley newspaper in 1934 have this image? So I was at the time looking into Yorkshire historical pageants of the interwar period. And it was to do with that this particular person came to my mind, Theodore Langbaine, who'd worked for the Shipley Times and Express, but was leaving in 1934 to take up a post on the Black Shirt, the official newspaper of the British Union of Fascists. He had been much involved in local affairs, and particularly dramatic ones, in Baildon, but now he was moving south. My assumption, therefore, was that he was connected very much with this use of the swastika. And in fact, very soon after joining the staff of the Black Shirt, was appointed its assistant editor. So I carried out a bit more research into him and found another letter from him that appeared in the Shipley paper later that year, Hyde Park and Baildon. And he was saying how sad he was that he hadn't been able to witness the Baildon pageant. He'd played a small part in the initial preparations, but he'd left. And then he said, preparations for a gathering of a rather different nature, a Black Shirt rally in Hyde Park, was what was occupying him now. So, mystery solved, apparently. I have tried to find out more about Theodore Langbaine, and Callum and Stuart MacDonald have helped me with this, and I've searched the internet. Can't find out anything more about him, though the surname Langbaine is German and is associated with some people who were on the far right in Germany. But I thought, well, I've solved the mystery. The swastika is used because of this man, even though it's no longer got the good luck connotations alone. However, looking into it further, I found that the Shippy paper kept using that border for 18 months or so after Langbaine left. So it is still an unsolved mystery, but one which has entertained me and I hope you found interesting. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Keith. That was great. Thank you very much. So we'll now go to questions, if we've got none there. If you just bear with me, we'll just get set up. Yeah, so everybody's on screen now. One for Chris. Mark's asking, what type of stone are the sculptures made from, or are they cement mouldings?
No, they're I don't know which precise stone they are made from, but they are carvings. They're not cement mouldings. They were carved in Fehr's studio and brought on site and installed. I think some of the school is built from Cloughton stone, but I'm not entirely sure which stone has been used for those features themselves.
And I think there's a question again for Chris from somewhere else in your household, I believe.
Yes, my wife, who's watching in another room, has asked a question, and she asked whether on the frieze depicting chemistry, whether the boy on the right is holding a cat, because apparently Priestley did some experiments whereby he put cats into bell jars and removed the oxygen. I wonder if I could share the screen and see if I could bring that up. Is that possible?
Yep.
Let's just go back. It doesn't seem to want to. I can't tell whether it is an animal. It could be. It might be a rabbit. In which case, it would definitely be Priestley. I'll have to go down there with some powerful binoculars and have a closer look at that, and hope I'm not arrested for looking at the building so closely.
Is the sale of the building still going through, Chris? Is there talk of turning?
I don't know. It's purely coincidental that this building's hit the news round about the time I'm giving this talk. I don't know, Simon.
I have a question for you, Chris. I was wondering, how long did it take him to actually do the sculptures? Have you any idea?
I don't know, Keith. School opened in 1900, didn't it? That photograph taken that started my talk was taken about 1901 or 1902. So they were obviously in situ then. He must have been commissioned very early on in the design process, because I would guess it would take him, I don't know, a year possibly to do them. I'll see if I can find out.
Because I was looking at them and just thinking about the sheer amount of work involved.
Yeah, although of course in many artist studios there would be assistants, and in fact Fehr himself worked as assistant earlier in his career. He worked as an assistant in the studios of other sculptors, so he wouldn't be working on them alone. There'd be almost apprentices or improver sculptors or whatever.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
And then not so much a question, more of a statement from Gordon on the swastika. It says that some of the borders look like some which are available on Microsoft Publisher. So I don't know if that's one for the conspiracy theorists or not.
I wasn't aware of that. I'll look into it later.
Okay, so I think that concludes the questions and things. So thank you to all for some really interesting and thought-provoking talks this evening. Coming up in 2 weeks' time, we've got Rob Robinson. We're talking about the Maritime Heritage Centre in Hull, and they're bringing the steam trawler Viola back from South Georgia. So thanks again once for tuning in, everybody. We hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you in a couple of weeks' time.